I've worked dozens of jobs in quiet neighborhoods across the state cleaning gutters, or painting garages, pressure washing moss covered driveways, but I've never had a job quite like this one. Started like any other gig, just a name, an address, and a task. But what happened that day shook me more than any fall off a ladder or electrical scare ever could. I never imagined a woman standing at her doorway in pajamas would be the moment my life shifted course. When she looked me in the eye and whispered, "Help me," I didn't know if she meant it emotionally, physically, or in some way I hadn't even begun to understand. But I knew in that moment I had to stay. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun was already working its way up the sky as I pulled into the long, tree-lined driveway of the house on Maple Hollow Road. It was one of those older homes built in the 60s, with a sloping front lawn and ivy creeping up the side of a wide brick porch. I was here for a simple job: pressure wash the driveway and walkway leading up to the front door. The house belonged to a woman named Lila Townsend, a name that sounded like it belonged in a Southern novel. I'd never met her before, only exchanged a few brief texts the week prior, confirming the time and service. She hadn't said much, just that she wanted it done before the weekend. I parked the van, unloaded the washer, and surveyed the mossy driveway. It looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The concrete was stained, cracked in places, and dotted with stubborn green growth. I clicked on my gloves, rolled out the hose, and fired up the washer. The first blast of water echoed across the yard like a starting gun, breaking the morning silence. I was midway through carving a clean line down the center of the drive when I heard the creak of the screen door behind me. At first, I didn't turn. People peek out all the time, checking on the work, offering water, occasionally trying to small talk above the roar of the washer, but this time felt off. Maybe it was the hush in the air, or the fact that no one had said anything. I glanced over my shoulder, and there she was, Lila. She looked like she had just stepped out of bed. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she wore soft plaid pajamas and bare feet. But it wasn't her outfit that struck me, it was her face. It was a tremble in her expression, like she'd been crying for hours or hadn't slept at all. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't loud and it wasn't casual. "Help me," she whispered. I turned the washer off immediately. The sudden silence rang in my ears as I took a few steps toward her. "Are you okay?" I asked, not sure what level of concern I needed to reach for. Was she hurt? Was there someone in the house? Did she fall? She opened the door fully and looked over her shoulder like she was expecting someone to follow her. Then she motioned for me to come inside. "Please, I can't be alone right now." I hesitated for only a second, then followed. The inside of the house was dim, with thick curtains drawn across every window. The living room was tidy, but lived in, with stacks of books on the coffee table and a dog-eared blanket thrown across the arm of the couch. There was a teacup on the counter and a faint scent of lavender. But what caught my attention wasn't the home, it was her. Lila moved slowly, carefully, like someone afraid of making noise. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands twisting in her lap, and after a few seconds of silence, she looked up. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know who else to call or trust, and I know I don't even know you." I sat down on the armchair across from her, setting my gloves aside. I didn't press. I just waited. She eventually took a shaky breath. "I've had someone watching me. It's not just online, not just weird texts. I mean physically watching me, leaving things outside. I thought I was being paranoid at first, but yesterday," her voice broke. "Yesterday, there was a note on my back door. No envelope, just taped there. Said, 'I know you're alone now, and the thing is, only one person would know that.' Her ex-husband." She hadn't said it, but I could tell from the way her voice tightened around the word alone. I didn't ask. It didn't matter yet. I offered her a glass of water, more as a gesture than a solution, and she nodded. As I stepped into the kitchen to fill a glass, I noticed a few things. The alarm panel on the wall was blinking red, not armed. A pile of unopened mail sat untouched. There was a subtle tension in the air, like a room that had been quiet too long. When I came back, She was staring at the closed curtains. She didn't blink for a few seconds. "I'm sorry to drag you into this," she said quietly. But the fact that someone else is here, it just makes me feel safer. I didn't leave, not that day. I finished the driveway while keeping one eye on the windows. I made sure the front door stayed locked. And when I packed up my tools hours later, she asked me if I could come back the next day, not for the job, just to check in. I said yes, without hesitation. That was how it started. The next morning, I didn't even wait for her to text. I just loaded the van early and stopped at the hardware store before heading to her place. I picked up some basic security gear, motion sensor, lights, a cheap door camera, and a few extra window locks. It wasn't much, but I figured it could give her some peace of mind. The air was cooler than the day before, and there was a quiet stillness in the neighborhood that felt both comforting and unnerving. As I pulled into her driveway again, I noticed she'd left the curtains slightly parted this time, just enough to peek out. I raised my hand in a small wave through the windshield, and within seconds, the front door creaked open. She looked better today, her hair pulled into a neater ponytail, a long cardigan draped over her frame, eyes still tired but more alert. She stepped out and gave me a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I asked if I could install the gear I brought, and she nodded immediately. There was no hesitation in her trust, which told me more about her current state than anything else. Most clients wouldn't be comfortable with a handyman drilling into their door frames or wiring lights to their porch. But Leela stood aside, offering coffee and gratitude like it was the only thing she had to give. I worked in silence at first, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. The front camera was simple Anufa, a battery-powered unit that could send alerts straight to her phone. I helped her install the app, walked her through the settings, and positioned the sensor light above her garage, so anyone who approached at night would be lit up like a spotlight. She watched me closely the whole time, not in suspicion, but in a way that felt heavy, like she was afraid if she blinked, the help would vanish once the basics were installed. I returned to the job I was originally there for, finishing the walkway. I didn't expect her to come outside again, but as I fired up the pressure washer, I heard the front door open and her footsteps across the porch. This time, she brought out 2 chairs and a tray with sandwiches and lemonade. I paused, turned, off the washer, and raised an eyebrow. She smiled, again closer to real this time. She said she figured I was probably hungry and that she didn't feel like eating alone. So I sat with her. I didn't say much at first. The air buzzed with distant lawnmowers and the occasional bird call. The shade from her overgrown maple trees offered a rare coolness for a summer day. When she did speak, it wasn't about the note or the fear, or even the ex-husband I was starting to suspect had caused her trauma. She asked me about me. She wanted to know how I got into handyman work, what I liked most about it, what the weirdest the job I'd ever taken was. I told her about a time I was asked to install a chandelier in a mobile home and ended up replacing half the ceiling. She actually laughed, and something about the sound caught me off guard. It was warm and rusty, like it hadn't been used in a while. I realized in that moment she wasn't just scared. She was lonely, the kind of lonely that seeps into the walls, that lives in the corners of a quiet home too long. After lunch, I asked if she had someone she could talk to, friends, family, anyone local. Her expression dimmed. Oh, she said she had a sister up north, but they weren't close. A couple friends from work, but she'd taken a leave of absence and hadn't talked to them in weeks. She mentioned therapy in passing, like someone brushing off a suggestion they weren't quite ready to commit to. I didn't push. I just nodded and asked if she wanted me to come back again tomorrow. This time she said yes, without looking down. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I started finding excuses to check on her. Even on days I wasn't scheduled to work, a follow-up on the camera install, checking the security light timing, dropping off some extra batteries. Each time, she seemed a little more grounded, like having someone in her space gave her structure. Again, I never stayed long, never made it feel like I was there to crowd her, just long enough to show she wasn't alone. One morning, About 5 days into this strange new routine, she greeted me at the door with a different kind of energy. She was in jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair down, a little makeup on. She looked like someone trying to rejoin the world. She asked if I wanted to help her clean out the garage, something she'd been avoiding since before her divorce. I agreed, and we spent the day moving boxes, sorting tools, and making small piles of keep, toss, or donate. That's when I learned more about her past. Lila had been married for almost 20 years. Her husband Darren had been charming in the beginning, attentive, witty, smart. But that charm slowly warped into control, not the kind with bruises or screams, but the quiet kind. The kind that made her second-guess every outfit, every friend, every decision. The kind that isolated her so thoroughly that when he finally left, she didn't even know who she was anymore. He'd been gone for over a year now, but the psychological grip hadn't fully released. And the note on her door, she was sure. It was him. No one else knew where she lived. She hadn't shared her new address with anyone from their shared past. But somehow, he found her. As she spoke, she kept her hands busy, folding towels, wiping down shelves. I could see the effort it took to talk about it, the years of practiced silence she was now trying to undo. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer platitudes or quick fixes. I just listened. At one point, she looked up and said, "It's strange. You barely know me, but I feel safer with you here than I did in that entire marriage." I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "a stranger can offer what familiarity never could: sincerity." That night, I installed a second motion light on the side of the house, just in case. As I packed up to leave, she asked if I could stay a little longer. We sat on the porch, watching the last bit of daylight fade behind the trees. She offered me another glass of lemonade, and for a moment we didn't speak. The silence felt different in outcome, not fearful. As I got in my van, she stepped closer and thanked me, not just for the lights or the driveway or the security, but for seeing her, really seeing her. I didn't have a good response. I just said I'd see her again tomorrow. I meant it. The following day, a gentle drizzle had soaked the neighborhood, leaving the leaves slick and the sky a muted gray. Still, I drove to Lila's place just as I'd promised. Even though the rain meant no outdoor work would get done, I figured the company alone would still count for something. I knocked lightly out of habit, even though I half expected the door to already be open for me. Instead, there was a pause before she answered, longer than usual, and when she did, her eyes looked distant again. Not frightened exactly, but unsettled in that way where you could feel her pulse before she even said a word. She motioned me in silently and walked back toward the kitchen, not offering an immediate explanation. The air inside felt different. From the day before, heavier, there was a half-drunk cup of tea on the counter and a couple of mail envelopes opened and scattered nearby. I followed her into the kitchen and waited. She finally broke the silence with a whisper that barely carried across the tiled floor. There was another note. My stomach tensed. I glanced down at the counter, and she slid a small piece of torn paper across to me. It wasn't long, just 3 words written in an unsteady scrawl. "Still watching you." That was it. No signature, no threats. Just enough to send a shiver up anyone's spine. I noticed her hand shaking slightly as she picked up the cup of tea again, fingers wrapping tightly around the mug like it was the only warm thing left in the room. I asked her where she'd found it, and she said it had been tucked under the windshield wiper of her car early that morning. She had gone out to grab something from the back seat and saw it wet with dew, staring right at her. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but everything inside me bristled. It felt like someone was testing her, pushing just enough to keep her on edge without crossing a line obvious enough for the police to act on. I asked if she'd filed a report, and she nodded, said the officer had taken a statement, but admitted there wasn't much they could do without more proof. Told her to document everything and to let them know if it escalated. The words had sounded hollow even to her. I took a deep breath and reminded her that she wasn't alone anymore. While I was around, it was the only thing I could offer in that moment that didn't sound like empty comfort. She nodded, visibly trying to steady herself, and suggested we tackle the storage room off the back porch. It was a space she'd been avoiding for months, but she suddenly wanted to take it back. I think she needed to reclaim something: control, space, strength. So we did. The room was cramped and dusty. It's filled with boxes labeled from a past life: wedding china, photo albums, holiday decorations, the kind of items that held the weight of years, not just memories. I could tell by the way she handled each box that she was deciding not just where it should go, but whether it deserved to remain in her life at all. We worked for hours, quietly sorting and lifting and discarding. Occasionally she'd pause and stare at something, like a framed picture of her wedding day or a college yearbook, then quietly place it in the donate pile without a word. At one point, she sat on an overturned crate and looked at me, eyes slightly watery. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked. "It's not the fear. It's the part of me that wonders if I deserve it. If all this is some kind of cosmic punishment for staying too long, for ignoring the signs, for believing love could fix someone who didn't want to be fixed." I stopped what I was doing and sat beside her. I told her that no one deserves to be haunted by people, by mistakes, by regrets. That sometimes the bravest thing isn't leaving, but learning to stay gone after you finally do. She didn't say anything, just reached out and squeezed my hand briefly before standing and returning to the task. The moment was small, but it shifted something between us. It was no longer just about keeping her safe. It was about reminding her she mattered, that she was still living. Still here? Later, we sat on the porch again, this time wrapped in a blanket as the drizzle turned into a quiet, persistent rain. I brought out a small Bluetooth speaker from the van and played some instrumental jazz, hoping the music might ease the atmosphere. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm wash over her like medicine, and after a while she began to talk not about fear or the ex or the notes, but about who she used to be. She told me she used to write poetry back when she was younger, before life demanded she be practical. That she'd once dreamed of teaching literature, but ended up in corporate HR instead. That she missed dancing in the kitchen, missed singing at the top of her lungs while cleaning on Saturdays. It was like she was trying to remember herself aloud, piecing together fragments that had been buried under years of silence. I didn't interrupt. I just let her speak, and when she finished, I said, "Maybe you still can. All of it." She looked at me like I'd just handed her a key to a locked door she hadn't tried in years. That evening, as I left, she surprised me by walking me to the van. She hugged herself against the cold, and just before I opened the driver's side door, she said, "Thank you, Mason, for making this feel less like a prison." I paused, not quite sure what to say. "You're not trapped here, Lila. You're rebuilding. And no one rebuilds alone." She smiled softly, and I saw a spark behind her eyes that hadn't been there when we first met. I drove away under the muted sky, but something told me I'd be back the next day. Not because of the job, not because she needed help, but because being around her felt like something rare, something honest. And deep down, I knew this was no longer just a client I was trying to protect. It was the beginning of something else entirely. By the time I returned the next morning, the sun had burned away the haze from the rain, and the world felt washed clean, like the first page of a new chapter. Lila greeted me at the door, not in her robe, not in the muted fog of worry, but in a soft blue hoodie and jeans, hair damp from a shower, and eyes that looked clearer than they had in days. She'd made coffee this time, 2 cups already poured, steam rising like some kind of quiet promise that today would be different, lighter, even if only by a thread. She invited me in before I could even knock, and I noticed something instantly. The curtains had been opened. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors like honey, and the house didn't feel like a bunker anymore. It felt lived in. She had classical music playing faintly in the background, and on the counter was a small yellow notepad with handwritten to-do items. Replace porch bulb, sort pantry, get groceries. Ordinary things, mundane things. But in a house that had felt frozen in time just days ago, it felt like motion, like momentum. I asked her what she felt like tackling first, and she smiled, really smiled. Dan said, "The ugly bush in the front yard. I've hated it for years. I chuckled and followed her outside, where the offending bush stood defiantly, half dead and unpruned, like it had been mirroring her emotional state for months. She handed me a pair of hedge trimmers and told me to be ruthless. I did as instructed, and together we spent an hour hacking away at it, laughing at the stubborn branches and discovering an old bird's nest hidden in the center. It was empty, fragile, forgotten. Lila stared at it for a long moment, her laughter slowly quieting, and then gently lifted it out with both hands and set it on the porch rail. She didn't say anything, but I knew it meant something. A symbol, maybe, of emptiness or beginnings, or both. We took a break afterward and sat on the steps drinking water from old mason jars. She looked over at me and said, "You know, I can't remember the last time I let myself be this relaxed with someone. It's like fear was my normal, and now I don't know who I am without it." I looked at her, the lines around her, eyes softening as she spoke, and I said, "You're whoever you decide to be now. That fear wasn't you. It was just what you had to survive." She looked away for a second, blinking hard. When she turned back, she smiled, and this time, stayed. We spent the rest of the day clearing out the porch, tossing old flower pots, sweeping debris, fixing loose nails on the steps. As she played music through a small speaker Fleetwood Mac, Norah Jones, some soft indie tracks I didn't recognize. She hummed as she moved, and at one point I caught her twirling a little, almost unconsciously, broom in hand like it was part of a dance. What was the kind of moment you don't interrupt? You just let it happen. Later, while I was loading up, tools in the back of the van, I noticed her standing on the porch, staring down the street. I walked over and followed her gaze. Black SUV was parked 2 houses down, engine running, windows tinted. It hadn't been there all day. I felt her body tense beside me, and instinctively I stepped a little closer. "You think that's him?" Quietly. She didn't answer right away, just kept staring. "I don't know," she finally said. "It could be a neighbor or a delivery guy. But my gut." I nodded and gently took her elbow. "Come inside for now." We went back in, and I watched from the window as the SUV idled for another 10 minutes before slowly driving off. No one got out, no packages were delivered, just a silent presence that had made its point and vanished. Lila looked at me, that flicker of fear back in her expression like a returning headache. I put down the water bottle I'd been holding and said, "Tomorrow I'll bring some of my friend Eli's gear. It is freelance security setups. More advanced than what I installed. Cameras that upload straight to the cloud. Motion alerts. You'll know if anyone's within 100 feet of this place." She nodded, grateful but worn out. We didn't talk much the rest of the afternoon. She went to make dinner just. "Frozen pizza," she said, "nothing fancy," and I stayed outside finishing up the last of the porch cleanup. When I came in to say goodbye, the lights were dimmed, and she was curled up on the couch. Pizza on a plate beside her, an old blanket wrapped around her shoulders. I told her I'd be back tomorrow with the new gear, and that I'd check the area once more before I left. She thanked me again, her voice quieter now. As I walked out into the cool evening, I felt that same sense of unease again, like we were being watched. I scanned the street, but everything looked normal. Still, I did a slow drive around the block before heading home, making note of every parked car, every porch light. I wasn't paranoid. I was preparing. Whoever had been leaving those notes was still lurking. They needed to know she wasn't alone anymore, that she had someone watching back. That night, I didn't sleep well. My thoughts kept returning to her face, how quickly it changed from soft to scared, how resilient she was trying to be, even when the ghosts kept knocking. I realized that this wasn't just a job anymore. I didn't want it to be. There was something about Lila that pulled at a deeper part of me, something protective, yes, but also connected. Like I'd known her longer than I had, like I'd seen pieces of myself in her struggle. I got up before dawn the next day and packed. The van, the cameras, the backup batteries, even a basic monitor she could keep on her nightstand. As I pulled out of my driveway, the sun hadn't risen yet, but I could already feel the weight of the day ahead. This wasn't just about a driveway anymore. This was about trust. This was about healing, and this was just the beginning. When I arrived at Lila's house just after sunrise, the street was still quiet. The world wrapped in that early morning stillness that feels like a held breath. The sky glowed with a faint blush of gold, and for a moment, the neighborhood looked like any other peaceful suburb. But the moment I stepped out of the van, that familiar sensation crept in again, a prickling on the back of my neck, a pulse of something just out of sight. I shook it off and got to work unloading the gear. Leela opened the door before I could knock. She looked better rested, wrapped in a thick cardigan and holding a steaming mug of coffee in both hands. She didn't smile exactly, but there was warmth in her eyes. "Early start?" she asked softly. I nodded and explained I wanted to get the cameras installed before the sun was too high. It would give me better visibility of shadow placement and angles. She stepped aside, letting me in without another word. I could tell she appreciated the urgency without needing to voice it. We started with the front door. It's always the most symbolic line of defense. Always. I mounted a small motion-activated camera above the frame, calibrated to ping her phone if anyone lingered longer than 30 seconds. From there, I moved around the house, one on the garage, another covering the side yard, and a final camera aimed at the backyard gate. Lila followed me as I worked, holding screws, handing me tools, asking smart questions. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was reclaiming control, and in that, I saw a shift I hadn't expected so soon. Inside, I set up the monitor and synced her phone to the app, walking her through the alerts and showing her how to save clips. She was focused, absorbing every word, asking what-if scenarios and how long footage would be stored. This wasn't fear now. This was preparation. She was done being a passive target. She was building her defense, brick by invisible brick. Took a break around mid-morning. She offered breakfast, just toast and eggs, but it felt like a gesture of thanks, something quietly intimate. We ate at her tiny dining table, the kind with one leg slightly shorter than the others that made your coffee ripple if you lean too hard. She laughed when I noticed it and said, "It's been like that for 5 years." I guess I stopped noticing. I offered to fix it, and she waved me off. "Not yet. Let it be a little uneven. It reminds me that I'm still adjusting." After we ate, she asked if I'd help her clear out the upstairs room. I hadn't been past the kitchen before, so this was new territory. The staircase creaked under our steps as we climbed, and at the top was a narrow hallway lined with old photos of her as a child. A younger version of her with long curls beside an older woman I assumed was her mother, and another of her in graduation. Robes holding a diploma, smiling like the world hadn't heard her yet. The room at the end of the hall had once been an office, judging by the broken desk and piles of boxes marked old files, miscellaneous, and do not open. She explained that it had been her ex-husband's space. After the divorce, she'd closed the door and never gone back. It felt like he was still here, she admitted. In the paint colors he chose, in the smell of his cologne that never quite faded, but I want it gone. I want to make this house mine again. So we began the slow excavation. There was something cathartic about it. Each box we opened felt like peeling off a layer of her past. Receipts, old software CDs, pay stubs, a few letters most impersonal, some clipped and cruel. She read a few aloud and winced at the memories they summoned. "He wasn't always awful," she murmured, "but when he turned, it was like the man I married had vanished. And the one who replaced him only saw me as a problem to be solved, or a weight to be endured." I didn't say anything. Sometimes the best way to hold someone up is to let them speak without offering solutions. We cleared out the space entirely, dragging old furniture to the curb and vacuuming corners that hadn't seen light in years. By late afternoon, the room was empty. Sunlight poured through the sheer curtains, and Lila stood in the center, slowly turning in a quiet circle. "I forgot how big this room is," she said softly. "I think I'll turn it into a reading space. Maybe some plants. A chair in the corner, somewhere I can breathe." I told her it sounded perfect, and for a moment we just stood there in the golden silence. Then her phone chimed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's an alert from the front camera," she said. "Someone walked past the porch just now. My shoulders tightened instantly. We went to the monitor in the living room and played the clip. The figure was hooded, dressed in black, and paused briefly at the edge of the frame, just long enough to look directly at the camera before continuing on. No clear face, no interaction, but deliberate, knowing, intentional. Lila stared at the screen and then whispered, "He knows we're watching." And suddenly, I realized we'd entered a different stage of this story. No longer about guessing if she was in danger. Now we were playing defense in a game we hadn't agreed to. I went outside to walk the perimeter while she stayed in. Checked fences, looked for footprints, scanned for anything left behind. Nothing. But that didn't ease the knot forming in my chest. Whoever this was, they weren't afraid to get close. And they wanted her to know it. When I came back inside, I found Lila sitting in the reading chair from the upstairs room. She had dragged it down, as if needing to be grounded in something she'd just reclaimed. She didn't look terrified. She looked resolved. "I'm not leaving," she said before I could speak. "He wants me to run, but I won't. This is my home. I'm done being afraid." I sat across from her and nodded. "Then I'm staying too." And just like that, an invisible pact was made and spoken, but binding. This was no longer a temporary job or an odd gig with a nervous woman. It had become something bigger than either of us could name yet. And I wasn't going anywhere. The next morning came quickly, though I hadn't slept more than a couple hours. My mind kept rewinding that moment when the hooded figure looked directly into the camera bowl, deliberate, like he wasn't just surveilling. It wasn't just about Lila anymore. He knew someone else was involved, now me, and I wasn't going to back away. I showed up at her place earlier than usual. The neighborhood was just beginning. 2 stir-joggers passing by, sprinklers turning on, the distant hum of someone mowing their lawn. It was the kind of peacefulness that made the previous night feel almost imagined, like a bad dream that didn't match the light of day, but I wasn't taking any chances. I parked 2 houses down and walked the rest of the way, scanning for anything out of place. Nothing stood out, but the calm felt too rehearsed, too quiet. Lila opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching for me. She wore a dark green sweater and held a cup of tea with both hands, her posture guarded but her eyes steadier than before. "I didn't sleep much," she admitted, stepping aside to let me in. "But I thought a lot. It's about what comes next." We sat in the kitchen, the same one where I'd first fixed her broken sink, and went over every detail of the previous day, replayed the camera footage for me again. I watched the stranger's slow walk, the moment he paused, the brief flash of his face barely visible in the reflection of the porch light. It wasn't much, but it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't random. He wasn't casing the house for burglary. He was sending a message to her, and now to me. I told her we needed to document everything going forward. It's not just footage, but logs. Times, dates, any cars or people we didn't recognize. I helped her create a folder on her computer labeled Security Incidents and added yesterday's video and screenshots. We even made a shared Google Drive in case something happened to her laptop. Redundancy. Backup. Safety in layers. As we worked, I saw her shoulders ease slightly. Not because the threat was gone, but because there was a plan. And sometimes, that's all a person needs to feel a little less powerless. A strategy. A structure. Something tangible to hold on to when the chaos starts creeping in. Around mid-morning, we stepped outside. The porch was brighter now, the old bushes trimmed back, the siding freshly scrubbed from my first day pressure washing. It looked like a different house, less like a hiding place, and more like a home reclaiming itself. She mentioned she wanted to repaint the door. Something warm, she said, like deep coral or mustard yellow, something that makes people stop and smile. I said I'd help, and she smiled faintly. "You keep offering to help with everything." She said, "Do you ever say no?" I shrugged. Not to people who whisper for help in their pajamas. She really laughed in for a moment. It cut through the tension like sunlight through clouds, reminded me why I was still there. Why I hadn't just finished the job and moved on. We went back inside, and she offered to show me something. She led me upstairs to a small linen closet next to the guest bathroom. At the bottom, Behind neatly folded towels and old cleaning supplies, she pulled out a shoebox. Inside were letters, dozens of them all handwritten. She explained they were from her ex. Letters he'd written her during their separation, promising to change, to come back, to make things right. But they weren't love letters. Not really. As I read a few, I noticed how every apology turned into a guilt trip. Every promise had conditions. If you hadn't pushed me, one read, I wouldn't have had to act that way. Another, you know you make me crazy when you ignore me. It was manipulation dressed in sincerity. She had saved them not because she believed him, but because part of her had needed proof, that she hadn't been imagining the slow erosion of herself under the weight of his words. People don't understand emotional abuse, she said. They think it has to leave bruises. Sometimes it just leaves silence where your voice used to be. I asked her what she wanted to do with them. She thought about it for a long moment. Then, without a word, she took the box downstairs, out to the fire pit in her backyard, and lit a match. We stood there as the letters curled into blackened ash, smoke rising like the last breath of a ghost finally being released. She didn't cry. She just watched, hands in her pockets, until nothing was left but glowing embers. We spent the rest of the day working on small things, tightening hinges, placing bulbs, fixing the wobbly leg on the dining table. All the little fixes that make a space feel safe again. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. Every screw, every sweep of the paintbrush, every cleared corner was like reclaiming another inch of her life. That evening, we sat on the porch steps with 2 cold drinks and watched the sun sink below. The horizon. The neighborhood had come alive again, kids biking past, sprinklers running, porch lights flicking on one by one. Lila leaned her head against the railing and said, "This is the first time I haven't flinched at the sound of footsteps in weeks." I looked at her, the lines of stress on her face softer now, and said, "You're allowed to feel safe. Even if it doesn't last forever, you're allowed to feel it now." She didn't respond right away. Then she turned to me and whispered, "I didn't think I'd ever say this, but I feel like I'm getting my life back. I don't know if that would have happened without you." There was a pause, not heavy, but full of meaning. And then we sat there in silence, not needing to fill the space with anything more. Just the wind in the trees, the flicker of fireflies starting to emerge, and the shared understanding that something had shifted between us, not rushed, not romantic yet, but rooted in something deeper. As night fell, I checked the cameras one last time, made sure the alarms were armed, and promised to return the next day. When I got in my van, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, watching her silhouette in the porch light. She had asked for help, and now she was helping herself. The next few days unfolded with a kind of quiet rhythm that surprised both of us. There was still tension in the air, a lingering wariness that neither of us fully acknowledged out loud, but it was softened by routine. I returned each morning, always early, always with something new in mind to tackle. Alila started texting. Me shortlists minor repairs, ideas for the backyard, even a photo of a garden bench she'd always wanted to build but never had the confidence to try. There was a momentum now, the sense that every screw tightened, every coat of paint, every inch of clean pavement wasn't just maintenance, it was a reclaiming. On Wednesday, we focused on her backyard fence. One side leaned dangerously, warped. By age and weather, felt symbolic. Somehow, how the boundaries of her life had sagged over time, worn down by years of accommodating others. She stood beside me, watching as I removed the rotted boards, hammering in fresh supports, leveling the posts with care. Occasionally, she held the wood steady, not saying much, but I could feel her watching not just the fence, but the way I handled it. Not rushing, not forcing, just rebuilding, one section at a time. We took a break under the shade of her lone maple tree. She brought out 2 lemonades, and we sat in folding chairs, sweat on our foreheads, dust on our clothes. She asked about my work, how I got into handyman jobs, whether I liked it. I told her the truth. I'd started out in construction, but left after a bad accident on site. Since then, I'd taken on smaller, more personal gigs, less noise, fewer people shouting orders. It's more space to breathe. She nodded, like she understood something unspoken. I used to work in publishing, she said. Small house, mostly cookbooks and lifestyle essays. I loved it. But after the divorce, everything felt smaller. The office, my ambition even, my voice. She looked out across the yard, her expression unreadable. It's strange, isn't it? How you can lose so much and still keep going, like a shadow of the person you used to be. I didn't interrupt. I'd learned by now that she didn't need comfort. She needed space to speak things she hadn't said aloud before. Eventually she turned to me and asked, "Do you think people really change? Like at their core?" I thought about it for a while before answering. I think people survive, and in the process, parts of them get reshaped. Not always by choice, but by necessity. That's its own kind of change. She nodded slowly, then looked back toward the fence. That's a good answer, she said. Softly, survival does leave a mark. By the afternoon, the new section of fence stood tall and straight, casting clean lines of shadow on the grass. She smiled at it like it was a gift, and in a way, maybe it was. A visible reminder that not everything broken stays that way. Later that evening, just as I was packing up, we both froze at the sound of a knock. It wasn't the front door, it was the side gate. A quiet, deliberate knock. I exchanged a glance with Lila, and in that moment, I saw all the progress of the past week threaten to crumble. Her shoulders tightened, her breath caught. Without a word, I reached for the monitor on the kitchen counter and pulled up the side. Camera feed? It was him again. Same hood, same jacket. Standing just beyond the fence I'd repaired, one hand resting on the gate like he owned it, but this time, he didn't look at the camera. He looked away toward the street before turning and walking off. No attempt to open the gate. No gesture. Just that eerie calmness that unsettled everything. Lila didn't speak. She just watched. The footage looped once, twice. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and then finally she said, "He wants me to feel watched, controlled, afraid." She looked up at me. But I won't give him that. That night I stayed longer than usual. We sat inside with the doors locked and the blinds down, the cameras. Checked and rechecked. I taught her how to activate a silent alarm feature through the app. We discussed calling the police again, but without direct contact or a crime, we both knew it would lead nowhere. "He's careful," she whispered. "Always just close enough to be felt, but never close enough to be caught." It wasn't just about physical safety anymore. It was psychological warfare. She was fighting it with nothing but stubborn will and growing strength. I admired that more than I could say. As I left that evening, I paused at the edge of her driveway, glancing back at the house. The porch light glowed softly, casting shadows against the newly painted trim. She stood inside, visible through the narrow crack in the curtains. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and she nodded once. Not goodbye. Not good night. Just still here. That night I couldn't sleep. I found myself thinking about her porch steps, the way she'd leaned into the wind like she wasn't afraid of it anymore. I thought about the letters she'd burned, the room she'd cleared out, the way she stood, taller each day, not because the fear was gone, but because she wasn't letting it decide her steps anymore. The next morning, I arrived with fresh bolts. For the gate, reinforced brackets. A motion-sensitive floodlight. She met me at the door with a tired smile and a cup of coffee. We got to work like nothing had changed, but everything had. There was no pretense anymore. No small talk to mask. The tension is to people building something stronger than fences or camera systems. Trust, mutual protection. A bond forming not from romance, but from resilience. By mid-morning, we'd secured the gate so tightly it would take a battering ram to get through. We tested the floodlight, adjusted the range, synced it with her app. When it lit up at the swipe of my hand, she exhaled a breath she'd been holding all week. "Looks good." She said. "Looks safe," I corrected. She smiled again, this time more openly. "I never thought I'd feel safe in this house again." I didn't tell her that safety isn't a place, it's a feeling you rebuild brick by invisible brick. But I saw that she knew it already. By the end of that week, something had shifted. Between Leela and me, subtle, but unmistakable. It wasn't anything romantic, not yet anyway, but it was a kind of quiet alliance. An emotional tether forged through long hours of shared silence and purpose. We didn't talk about the hooded man again directly, but everything we did was a response to his presence. It was like reinforcing a house after a storm. You don't speak about the wind, but every nail and screw says, never again. Saturday was supposed to be my day off, but I showed up anyway. I brought a small toolkit and a bag of groceries, figuring I could finish the garden bench we'd discussed and maybe convince her to take a break from her own constant cleaning and worrying. When she opened the door and saw me there, dressed like any other day, holding a bag of bell peppers and fresh bread, she didn't even try to pretend she wasn't glad. I was going to ask you to come by, she said, stepping aside to let me in, but I didn't want to assume. I shrugged. Figured we were past that by now. She led me to the kitchen where the scent of lavender lingered. One of those candles with a name like Rainy Day in Provence was burning faintly on the windowsill. The house had started to feel lived in again. Not just maintained, but claimed. There were potted herbs on the counter, a row of wind chimes by the back door, and a new welcome mat that said, "Try kindness." It made me smile. We worked on the bench together in the backyard. I did most of the heavy lifting, but she insisted on helping with the sanding and staining. Her hands were more skilled than I expected, steady, patient. My dad was a carpenter. She told me at one point, not professionally, just in his spare time, used to build dollhouses for my sister and me. Tiny details. Even running water in the sinks. I always admired how he could create whole worlds with wood and nails. I glanced at her hands as she worked, smudged with stain and grit. Thought about how healing sometimes looks like building something simple and solid. Something that reminds you what your hands are capable of. By midday, we were sitting on the finished bench, the stains still drying, eating sandwiches on paper towels and drinking lemonade. The sky was overcast but warm, and for the first time, in days there was no sense of urgency hovering over us, just a calm, quiet, like a held breath finally being released. She turned to me suddenly, her expression more serious than before. "Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. Double quotes. "Why do you really do this? I mean all of it. Helping me, staying longer than you have to, coming back even when you could have walked away." It caught me off guard, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I hadn't realized how much I'd needed to be asked. I looked out at the yard for a long time before replying. "A couple years ago," I said slowly, "I worked on a house for this older couple. The wife had cancer. The husband was trying to remodel the bathroom so she could access it with a wheelchair. But he didn't know what he was doing. He'd messed up the plumbing and the tiles. I came in to fix it, but I ended up staying longer, helping with meals, moving furniture. They didn't have kids, and he was exhausted. One day she told me I was the first person who'd shown up for them without being asked. That stuck with me. Sometimes people don't know how to ask for help, or they're too used to hearing no to even try. So now, if I can help, I do. Lila didn't say anything for a while. Then she reached over and rested her hand briefly on mine. Not romantically, not even gratefully, just a quiet gesture of understanding. A kind of shared solitude being acknowledged. That afternoon, we took a walk around the neighborhood. It was something she hadn't done in weeks. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, more out of habit than necessity. We passed kids playing. Basketball in a driveway, a couple pruning roses, a man washing his car with music playing low from the garage. The world looked so normal, it was almost surreal. When we circled back to her street, she hesitated at the corner. I used to love this neighborhood, she said. The quiet, the trees, the old houses, with their crooked shutters. I picked this place because it felt like something out of a novel. But for a long time now, it's felt like a cage. Do you still feel that way? I asked gently. She took a breath, looked around, then slowly shook her head. No, not today. At our house, we watered the garden beds and cleaned up our tools. The sun had started to break through the clouds, casting long golden rays across the porch. I was just about to head out when she said, "Wait." She disappeared into the house and came back with a small box. "I was going to give this to Goodwill," she said, handing it to me. Inside was a neatly folded flannel shirt, a small carved wooden bird, and a pair of gloves. "They were my dad's. I think he would have liked you." It was the kind of gesture that didn't need a response. I took. The box had nodded. Before I left, we stood on the porch for a while, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. The bench we'd built together sat beneath the maple tree, drying in the sunlight like a symbol of something neither of us could name just yet. "I don't know what this is," she said finally, "but I know it's helped." "Me too," I replied. As I walked away, I didn't look back right away. I could feel her watching, not out of fear anymore, but because she wanted to hold on to the feeling of someone staying. And that, more than anything, told me we were both slowly moving out of survival mode and into something more like living again. Monday morning rolled in quietly, sunlight dripping through the blinds in that slow, golden way that makes the air feel warmer than it is. I arrived earlier than usual, unsure if Leela would be awake or if I'd be overstepping some new unspoken boundary by showing up unannounced. But the moment I stepped onto the front porch, I saw the front door already. Slightly open, the smell of fresh coffee drifting out. That small gesture, her leaving the door cracked open, felt like a bigger invitation than any words. She could have spoken. Inside, she was standing in the kitchen, 2 mugs already poured, wearing a soft gray sweater and loose jeans. Her hair pulled back in a messy braid. She looked casual but not careless present. I noticed, too, that the kitchen sink I had fixed days ago gleamed beneath the morning light. Next to it, a new bouquet of flowers sat in a glass jar. Sunflowers. "This time, I figured you'd come," she said without turning around. "I wasn't sure," I admitted. "Well, I was." She handed me one of the mugs, her fingers brushing mine for just a second longer than necessary. "You want to tackle the garage today?" The garage. That dark, crowded space we hadn't dared mention until now. The last part of the house she hadn't touched. It wasn't just full of tools or junk, it was full of ghosts. Boxes from a marriage long ended. Unfinished projects from a man who had left. Holiday decorations they probably never used. And beneath all that, years of avoidance layered like dust. But I nodded. Together, we walked out to it. The door creaked open with a protest, revealing a dim space filled with stacks of storage bins, old paint cans, an unused treadmill buried. Beneath sheets and cobwebs hanging from the corners like gray lace. Lila didn't move right away. She stood just inside the threshold, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "I haven't been in here since he left," she murmured. "It used to be his domain. I'd ask him to clean it up, and he'd promise he would, but he never did. And then it became easier to pretend it didn't exist." I glanced around, noting the boxes marked with fading Sharpie labels. Taxes, 2012. Christmas decor paint samples do not throw out. We started slowly, opening one box at a time, working in silence. Old tax records. Broken kitchen gadgets. Children's books that made her pause. "He wanted kids," she said quietly at one point, lifting a weathered copy of Goodnight Moon. "I didn't. Not because I didn't love him, but because I didn't trust myself to be a good mother. I didn't come from the kind of home that teaches you how to nurture. I didn't push for more. Some stories needed space to exhale." By noon, we'd cleared a path to the back wall, uncovering a workbench with an old vice grip and a box of rusted nails. I found a small toolbox. Under a tarp, most of the tools inside were in good condition. She smiled faintly when I handed her a hammer. "Used to say I'd hurt myself if I used one of these." Funny thing is, I was the one who showed him how to hang shelves when we first moved in. As the hours passed, the garage began to shift. It no longer looked like a graveyard of forgotten plans, it looked like a blank slate. By late afternoon, the floor was swept, the walls visible, and the clutter either donated, tossed, or organized. Lila sat on an overturned bucket, wiping sweat from her brow, her eyes scanning the now open space. "I forgot how big this place was," she said. Feels like I gained a whole room back. You did? I said. You just needed permission. She looked at me. No, I just needed a witness. We packed up the last few donation boxes, setting them by the door. Then we stood in the middle of the garage, letting the air settle. It was quiet, but not heavy, and then, without warning, loud thump startled both of us, a sharp crack against the back fence, followed by the sound of rapid footsteps retreating. We both rushed outside. I scanned the yard, but whoever had been there was already gone. Lila went to the fence, where a rock now sat in the dirt. Wrapped around it was a strip of paper, tightly folded and tied with twine. My stomach dropped. She opened it slowly. Read, "You can clean the house, but you can't clean your past." Her hands trembled. She read it again, then again. I saw the tears pool at the edges of her eyes before she blinked them back. The progress of the last week suddenly felt paper-thin. But then something unexpected happened. She crumpled the note, turned, and walked back inside. No screaming. Panic. Just a steady, slow march back into her house. I followed her in. She grabbed a glass jar from under the sink, unscrewed the lid, and dropped the note inside. I noticed what was already inside the jars. Several other bits of paper burned, or torn, each one sealed away like evidence. She screwed the lid back on and placed it on the shelf above the fridge. "I'm not pretending this doesn't bother me," she said finally, "but I'm not going to let it control me anymore. He wants fear. He wants a reaction. He doesn't get one today." It was strength wrapped in vulnerability. A choice. And I realized I'd never admired anyone more. We sat on the couch for a while, both of us drained but still very much awake. The shadows grew long across the walls. Outside, the wind picked up and leaves danced across the porch. "I feel like I'm living in a thriller novel," she said, trying to smile. "Yeah," I agreed, "but I think we're past the halfway mark. That's when the main character starts to fight back." She looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in her gaze. Not romantic, not yet, but deeper. Trust, maybe. Or the beginning of it. "I'm glad it was you at the door that morning," she said. "I am too," I replied. Outside, the floodlight blinked on as dusk settled in. The bench beneath the tree still stood, a little reminder of quiet progress. The cameras hummed silently. And inside, two people sat shoulder to shoulder, no longer defined by the shadows of what had happened, but by the choices they were making. Now, the next morning, I expected her to call and say she needed a break, that the message on the rock had unraveled too much progress too fast. But instead, my phone buzzed just after 8. It was a short text, 3 words, 1 period. "See you soon." And with that, I loaded the truck and headed to her house like it was the most natural thing in the world. When I pulled into the driveway, the morning sun was cutting a sharp angle over the rooftops, bathing her front yard in pale gold. The driveway was clean now, like a freshly wiped slate. I noticed her front step had been swept, the weeds along the edges trimmed. She was reclaiming territory, bit by bit. And when she opened the front door, she was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. Her hair pulled back, a hammer in her back pocket like it belonged there. "I thought we'd finish the shed," she said, barely giving me time to greet her before handing me a fresh cup of coffee. "I want that space cleared. I don't want to avoid corners of my own home anymore." We walked around the side of the house, where the old tool shed sat, slouched against the fence like an old man. It was the last untouched spot, the last place he had full dominion over. The door creaked, resisting us like it had something to hide, but we pushed through. Inside, the smell of mildew and forgotten wood met us like a wall. There were spider webs across the rafters, buckets stacked high with who knows what, rusted tools that hadn't been touched in years, but she didn't flinch. She stepped in like a general entering contested ground. We worked in tandem. I pulled old garden hoses from the corner, unraveled old extension cords knotted around nails, while she sorted through boxes of screws, jars of washers, half-used paints with labels so faded you had to guess the color. Every few minutes I'd glance at her, expecting hesitation. But she moved with purpose, almost with defiance. Then I found it. A small wooden crate tucked under the workbench, sealed with masking tape, Lila's name scribbled across the top. In black marker, it wasn't dusty like everything else. It had been handled recently. So recently, I didn't open it without asking. She saw it in my hands and froze. "That wasn't here before," she said slowly. Bared voice dropped a register, barely more than a whisper. "I didn't put that there." She stepped closer, watched her eyes scan the crate like it was a landmine. Then, swallowing hard, she took the box from my hands and opened it herself. Inside was a collection of things that made no sense until they did. A photograph of her from years ago, smiling next to a dog she once mentioned had passed. A copy of a grocery list she hadn't made in over a year. A lipstick she'd lost. A charm bracelet. Notes. So many notes. Scrawled in a man's handwriting, "You look better when you smile. Remember who made you safe. Come back and I won't have to follow you again." She dropped the box. I stepped forward to catch her elbow as her knees buckled slightly. Her face had drained of color. "He's been here," she whispered, not crying, not screaming, just stating it like a terrifying truth. "Not just outside. He's been inside my walls. Watching." I guided her out of the shed without a word. Once we were in the sun again, I pulled my phone and called the police, not just to report it, but to insist on a proper investigation. They said they'd send someone that afternoon. I told them it wasn't soon enough. Then I called a locksmith, a contractor, and a security consultant. I wasn't waiting anymore. Back inside, Lila sat at the edge of the couch, rocking slightly. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "I thought I was doing better," she said, her voice low. "I really thought I was getting past it. I had one night where I didn't check the locks 5 times. One night where I left the light off in the hallway. I thought, you are doing better," I said, crouching beside her. "This doesn't erase that. This is a man trying to claw back control, and you're not giving it to him. You're still here, still fighting." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I could see the conflict in her eyes, fear and pride wrestling with each other. But something in her shoulders relaxed. "You don't have to keep showing up," she said. "I know," I replied. "That's why I do." That afternoon, we installed new locks on every door, reinforced the back windows, changed the codes on the garage. I helped mount new motion lights and check the range of the security cameras. It wasn't just about protecting the house, it was about giving her power again, about helping her believe that she wasn't just reacting to fear anymore, but building resistance against it. The police finally arrived late in the day, took statements, and photographed the crate and its contents. They couldn't promise anything. "If there's no fingerprints or DNA," the officer said with a practiced shrug, "it'll be hard to prove he was here." I could have punched the wall. Lila remained calm. She thanked them, even smiled politely. But when the door shut behind them, she looked at me and said, "It's up to us, isn't it?" "For now," I said. "But you're not alone in this anymore." She didn't say anything to that. Just walked to the kitchen and started cooking, her movements precise and focused. As she chopped vegetables and stirred the pot, I saw something I hadn't before: determination, edged with rage. Not wild rage, controlled. Cold, purposeful. She wasn't scared anymore. She was planning. We ate in the dining room that night, not on the couch. Candles lit, plates set, wine poured. It's not like a date, something more grounded than that, more human. Talked about little things, music, favorite books, memories that didn't hurt. And for a while, it almost felt normal. After dinner, we sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. No headlights appeared. No strange sounds. No sudden knocks. Just the slow rhythm of crickets and wind chimes. And eventually, she spoke again. "If he comes back," she said, "I'll be ready." "I know," I said. "But if I have anything to say about it, he won't get that far." She leaned back, eyes closed, face turned toward the stars. Isn't what I imagined rebuilding my life would look like? "No one ever imagines it, right?" I said. "But it still counts." We sat in silence after that, 2 silhouettes in the fading light, holding space not just for safety but for something else too, something like a promise. The next morning, the neighborhood felt colder. Not because of the weather, though. Sky hung heavy with gray butt because of the weight of the past 2 days. That box in the shed had changed everything. It was no longer just about lingering trauma or paranoia. It was now undeniable, physical proof that someone he was actively invading her space, her peace, her sense of safety. And even though we'd reinforced the house and added cameras, the air still felt unsettled. Lila didn't say much that morning. She moved like someone quietly preparing for war. She met me outside just as I arrived, holding 2 cups of coffee. Wearing that same flannel shirt and a calm expression that looked practiced but not fake, she handed me one without a word and gestured toward the side of the house. "I think it's time we clear out the garden bed." She said it was the smallest section of her yard wedged between the fence and the house, a strip of overgrown rosemary, lavender, and stubborn weeds. But I understood the symbolism immediately. This was the space directly beneath her bedroom window. The one spot she'd never asked me to clean, trim, or even approach. The one area she avoided even when the rest of the house was being repaired. And renewed, we got to work side by side in silence. The weeds came up easier than I expected, as if they, too, were tired of clinging to the past. She knelt down to pull up the dead roots with her bare hands, digging deep into the soil until her nails were caked with earth and her knuckles scraped red. "I used to plant tulips here," she finally said, "years ago, every spring. Them said they were too bright, too childish. He'd mow over them the second they bloomed." She paused, sitting back on her heels. "It got to a point where I stopped planting. I stopped buying flowers altogether." She glanced up at me, and her voice cracked just slightly. "It's stupid how something so small can stay with you." "Yeah, it's not stupid," I said. "It's survival." We cleared the bed entirely, dug it down a few inches, and filled it with fresh soil from bags I had brought in the back of the truck. She didn't ask why I had them. Maybe she already knew I would. By midday, the bed was clean, ready for whatever came next. But instead of rushing out to buy new flowers, she simply sat beside the empty plot, sipping water and breathing. "Maybe next week," she said. "Maybe something that blooms slowly, like peonies." That afternoon, we started sanding the front porch railing. It had grown brittle over the years, with paint peeling like curled paper and the wood beneath turning gray. She hadn't sat out front in years, she told me, because it felt too exposed. But now, with everything changing, she wanted the porch to feel like an invitation again, not a barricade. I showed her how to work the sander. She caught on quickly, arms steady, rhythms strong. With each pass, the years seemed to come off not just the wood, but from her posture, her eyes, her voice. By the time the railing was smooth, she looked lighter, not fixed, but freer. We finished. Just as the sun dipped low behind the trees, packed up my tools. But before I could leave, she stopped me at the bottom step. "I've been thinking," she said, "about how I want to live now, about what kind of life I deserve. Not just one without fear, but one with meaning." She hesitated, then added, "Would you be willing to stay for dinner again? Not because I need help, just because I'd like the company." There was no hesitation in my answer. I followed her inside. She made pasta, humming softly under her breath, while I opened a bottle of wine she had pulled from the top shelf. We ate by the window this time, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. She told me about her favorite movie growing up, The Secret Garden. I told her about the time I accidentally flooded my mother's kitchen trying to fix the sink at 10 years old. We laughed, real laughter in that sound. In her house felt revolutionary. Later, as I got up to leave, she walked me to the door. The air between us was still, but thick with something unspoken. Gratitude, perhaps. Or the early stirrings of something deeper. She placed a hand on my forearm and said, "You made me feel like this house was mine again." "It is yours," I said. "It always was." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not out of worry, but from the emotional whiplash of the past few days. Her resilience was staggering. The way she reclaimed space, not just physically, but emotionally, made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about strength. She didn't bulldoze forward. She moved like a storm, gathering slowly, quietly, and then reshaping the landscape without apology. The next morning I arrived to find her already outside. She was at the garden bed again, kneeling beside a small collection of new seedlings. Not tulips, not peonies, wildflowers, untamed, hardy, bright. I changed. My mind, she said, grinning. I want something that spreads. We planted them together. As we dug and placed and watered, she told me about a book she wanted to write, something about starting over at 42, about women who survived, not dramatically but subtly. One cracked tile at a time, one cleared shed, one pressure-washed driveway. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her voice. Afterward, we sat on the porch again. She leaned back in the chair, watching the wind ripple through the grass. He might still be out there, she said, after a long silence. Maybe, I replied. But he's not in here anymore. She nodded. No, he's not. Over at me, and her eyes held no fear? I never thought I'd feel this way in my own skin again. But I do. I reached over and gently squeezed her hand. That's the part no one tells you, I said. That healing doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like quiet mornings and safe hands. The sun was warm. The porch creaked beneath. Our feet, and somewhere beneath it all, the roots of wildflowers were beginning to stretch, patient and unstoppable. A few days passed without incident. And in that rare pocket of peace, something shifted between us, not suddenly, but gradually, like the way dawn pushes night back, one soft hue at a time. Lila began to invite me over without needing a project as an excuse. One afternoon it was tea in the backyard. Another evening a movie she hadn't seen in years but suddenly remembered. I noticed how her voice no longer carried that guarded edge, how her laugh came quicker now, less tentative, more full. She even started leaving her windows open during the day, trusting the air again. One afternoon, I arrived with nothing but my hands in my pockets and a bag of oranges. She grinned when she opened the door. Let me guess, she said. You read some article about how citrus is good for the soul? Something like that, I said. Or maybe I just thought they'd look good in your kitchen. Me in, and we sat by the counter while she peeled one, handing me half. The kitchen had transformed, no longer a place that held shadows or tension. The cabinets had been painted a warm cream, and a new hanging plant swayed gently in the window. On the fridge were photos I hadn't seen before, a younger version of her sister maybe, and one of her dog when it was just a pup. I pointed to it, and she chuckled. That's Scout. He was my best boy for 13 years. Sometimes I still catch myself calling for him. You thinking of getting another? I asked. She hesitated. Eventually, but not yet. Right now I'm still remembering how to take care of myself. It struck me how honest she'd become. Not just with me, but with herself. There was no performance anymore, no curated version of her life. It was raw and real, and all the more beautiful for it. Later, we found ourselves outside again. The porch had become our usual evening haunt. The new railing glowed faintly in the late sunlight, and the wildflowers in the side bed had begun to lift their heads. She leaned back in her chair, legs stretched out, her hand brushing against mine on the armrest. It wasn't intentional, but neither of us moved. I keep thinking about how you showed up that day, she said quietly. How you didn't flinch when I asked for help. Most people, it would have stepped back, or made it about themselves. But you didn't. I didn't have to think, I replied. You needed help. That was enough. She looked at me, and there was something unreadable in her eyes. Not fear, not grief. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. I don't think I've ever felt that safe with anyone, she said. And there it was, the quiet. Truth between us, no longer hiding in subtext. I could feel the weight of her words settle into the space like a seed finally finding soil. But I didn't rush to respond. I let the silence speak for a while. We both did. The next day Lila called me earlier than usual. There was a different tone in her voice, urgent, but not panicked. Can you come by, she asked. I just need you here. When I arrived, she was standing by the gate, arms crossed, jaw tight. I followed her gaze and saw a car parked across the street, nondescript, gray, but it hadn't been there before, and I knew she was sure of it. It's been there since last night, she said. No one's gotten in or out. Studied the car for a long minute. Windows tinted. Plates. Out of state? No visible damage or motion? It's just sitting there like a threat disguised as nothing. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But I also didn't want to dismiss her instincts not after everything. I already called the non-emergency line, she said. They said unless it's blocking traffic or I see someone break in, there's nothing they can do. Of course they did. I walked with her back toward the house. We'll keep an eye on it, I said. And I'll stay here tonight. She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded. Thank you. That night, we kept the porch light on. I parked my truck closer to the house, made sure her phone was fully charged, and helped her double-check every lock, every window. We didn't talk much, just moved together through the quiet like soldiers setting up camp. When it was time for bed, she paused in the hallway. Will you sleep in the guest room? She asked, voice soft. Of course, I said. As long as you need. The guest room was sparse but clean. The bed smelled like lavender, and the sheets were freshly laundered. I lay there in the dark, listening to the creaks of the old house, alert for any unfamiliar sound. But none came. In the morning, the car was gone. She didn't say anything when she saw the empty curb, but I saw her shoulders relax an inch. Maybe two. We had coffee on the porch again, the silence between us less heavy this time, as if we'd passed another unspoken test. After breakfast, she said she wanted to go into town, not for errands, but to walk. I haven't been to the farmer's market in over a year, she said. I used to go every Saturday. I didn't like crowds, so I stopped. But I think I want to go today. We drove in together, parked near the square, and joined the slow wave of weekend shoppers. She held her head high, smiled at vendors, touched tomatoes and oranges, and small jars of honey like someone remembering what living felt like. We bought fresh bread, lavender soap. A bar of chocolate, she insisted, was too expensive but bought anyway. It wasn't about groceries. It was about reclaiming joy. On the way back, she turned to me and said, I didn't panic, not once, even when someone bumped into me. I just kept breathing, I noticed, I said. She smiled, eyes shining. I'm still scared, but I'm not stuck. Back at her place, we put the groceries away like a couple who'd done this every weekend for years. And then, out of nowhere, she asked, Do you ever think about what this is? Between us? I paused, unsure how to answer. I do, I said. All the time. I don't know if I'm ready for something serious, she said, but I know I feel different when you're around. It's better, more me. That's all I've ever wanted, I told her. For you to feel like you again. That was enough. For now, the following week brought rain. Not the kind that lashes sideways and makes everything feel like chaos, but a slow, consistent drizzle that softened the world into a blur of grays and deep greens. I thought maybe Lila would use it as an excuse to stay in, to retreat again. But instead, she called me that Monday morning with an idea that caught me completely off guard. I want to paint the living room, she said. It's too beige. It's always been beige, like an old waiting room. She paused. I'm thinking something bold. Maybe green, not dark but rich, like moss. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I could hear how serious. She was like this wasn't just about a wall color, but about changing the rules of her space again. And something in me felt grateful and art even that she wanted me to be a part of it. I'll bring the rollers, I said. You pick the shade. That afternoon, I showed up with tools, drop cloths, and a playlist we could work to. She had already gone to the hardware store and picked out 3 different paint samples, all in shades of green, so close you could only tell the difference when the light hit them just right. We painted little squares on the wall and stood there like art critics. Arms crossed, heads tilted. That one, she said, pointing to the second. It looks like spring trying to come back after winter. We started that evening. It was slow going at first. I handled the high corners, and she took her time cutting around the windows and floorboards. We played music, sometimes sang under our breath, and every so often, we'd stop to admire how drastically the space was transforming. The paint covered more than just drywall. It covered silence, it covered old echoes, and it replaced them with something new, something alive. Midway through the second wall, she stepped back, her brush still in hand, and said he would have hated this. I looked at her. You don't seem too bothered by that? I'm not, she said. Not anymore. I used to measure everything I did by how angry it might make him. Even my joy, especially my joy. She dipped her brush again and kept painting. By the time we finished the first coat, it was dark outside. We were both speckled with painter more than me because she had stopped being careful somewhere. Around the third song that played and the house smelled of fresh color and warm coffee, she lit a candle on the mantel and we stood there, shoulder to shoulder, staring at the wall. It feels like someone else's house, she said softly. Maybe that's a good thing, I said. Maybe it's your house now. She looked at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled, small and real. Yeah, maybe it is. The rain continued that night, steady and soft. Stayed late again, not because she asked me to, but because leaving felt wrong. I made tea while she took a shower. And when she came back into the living room with her hair wet and face clean of makeup, she looked almost startled by how warm and lived in the space had become. We sat on the couch together, watching the rain run in rivulets down the windows. She pulled a blanket over her lap and offered to share it. I took the corner she held out, careful not to make it feel like more than it was, and still, our knees touched. There's a kind of silence I never knew I needed, she said. Not the kind where you're ignored, but the kind where you don't have to explain yourself. You just exist, and someone sees it, accepts it. I nodded. The world's loud enough without us having to fill every second. She turned to look at me again, and this time, the expression was different. Something between invitation and fear. Do you think it's possible, she said slowly, to start over with someone, Evan, when you've already spent so many years learning how not to trust? I think that's the only way most of us ever start anything real, I said. When we're done pretending we're fine, there wasn't a kiss. It's no sweeping orchestral music. Just two people sitting in the middle of a room that was finally theirs, painted in defiance, lit with soft firelight and the scent of lavender and rain. And something in that moment felt more intimate than any confession could. She fell asleep. With her head against my shoulder, and I didn't move for a long time, I listened to the rain, to the occasional creak of the house settling, and to the rhythmic breath of someone who had finally exhaled when I eventually carried her to her room and laid her down. She didn't wake. I stood at the doorway for a long minute, just watching, not out of some romantic fantasy, but out of awe at her strength, at how far she'd come, at how she had, slowly and deliberately, invited safety back into her life and chosen to name it hers. Back in the living room, I stretched out on the couch. The green walls looked darker in the moonlight, but no less alive. I closed my eyes, wondering what the next morning would look like, not just for her, but for us. Because something was changing, not just in the house, not just in her, but in me. The morning light spilled through the kitchen window with a softness that made everything feel gentler than it had the day before. I woke to the sound of birdsong filtering through the open crack of a window and the faint hum of Lila's footsteps on the hardwood floors. The green walls, now dry and luminous, felt like a promise kept, like a space that had finally caught up to the person who lived inside it. I stretched, groggy but content, and followed the scent of coffee to the kitchen. She was already there, wearing a worn flannel shirt and sweatpants, barefoot and humming under her breath as she stirred milk into her cup. Cheekbones, and for a moment, I didn't say anything. I just watched her move and bothered, relaxed. It was no performance, no guardedness. She was just herself. She looked up and grinned when she saw me. You sleep okay? Better than I have in a long time, I replied. She handed me a mug and leaned against the counter. Both of us sipping in that comfortable morning quiet that doesn't need words. I glanced around the room, remembering how it had felt the first day I stepped into a dim, closed off, heavy, with unspoken things. Now, even the shadows seemed lighter. I've been thinking, she said after a while. I want to start working again." I raised my eyebrows but didn't interrupt. "Not full-time, not yet, but maybe something part-time. At the bookstore downtown, they're hiring someone to help with the inventory and displays. Me and I used to love books," before she caught herself, then shrugged. "Before I forgot I love things." "That sounds perfect," I said. "You'd be good at that." She smiled, but it held a trace of uncertainty. "What if I panic? What if it's too much too soon?" "Then you take a break and try again, or not. No shame in pacing yourself." It was strange how our conversations had evolved from short, guarded exchanges to these open, meandering talks that carried weight without ever feeling heavy. And she listened now, not just with her ears, but with her whole self, like she was learning to be present in her own life again. Later that day, she asked if I'd help her build some raised garden beds for the backyard. It was something she'd always wanted to do, but had been too afraid to try. He used to say gardening was a waste of time. She muttered as we measured the space and mapped out the layout. "So that means it's probably exactly what you should be doing." I replied. We drove to the hardware store together, picked out cedar planks and soil, and even found a few starter herb plants: basil, rosemary, mint. She held them delicately, the way someone might hold something sacred, and smiled in a way that told me this was more than just a project. It was a reclamation. We spent the rest of the day building, getting our hands dirty and laughing when the drills slipped or when one of us misread the instructions. The air was thick with the scent of soil and wood, and the sun set slow and golden behind the trees. It felt like summer, even though we were still weeks away from it, as we watered the soil and planted the herbs. She paused and looked at me. "I feel like I'm building something real," she said. "Not just with the garden, but here, in me. With you." I didn't know what to say, but I reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. We stood there for a while, not speaking, just watching the breeze bend the tall grass and carry the scent of rosemary through the air. Her grip tightened slightly, like she was anchoring herself to the moment. To me, that evening I cooked dinner while she showered. Nothing fancy, just pasta with garlic and olive oil and a simple salad. When she came back into the kitchen, her hair still damp and falling over her shoulders, she looked at the table and then at me with an expression that stopped me cold. Not surprise, not gratitude, but something deeper, something like trust. "This feels like a life," she said, "like a small, quiet life that belongs to me." I nodded. "That's exactly what it is." After dinner, we watched an old movie, something black and white that she said reminded her of her grandmother's house. She curled up next to me on the couch, her head against my chest, and I realized I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. I wasn't expecting a kiss or some grand gesture. Just this. Her weight against me, the flicker of the screen, the smell of paint and rosemary in the air. When the movie ended, she didn't move. She just whispered, "Stay." And I did. That night, the house didn't creak as much. The wind was quiet. The rain had stopped. There was only the soft rhythm of her breath beside me and the warmth of the blanket we shared in the dark. She said something so low I almost missed it. I used to dream of a man who didn't try to fix me, just made space for me to fix myself. I turned slightly, brushing my fingers against her hand. And I think I found him. My throat tightened, but I didn't speak. There was no need, because sometimes the strongest declarations are whispered, not shouted. And sometimes the greatest love is the one that doesn't demand anything, but simply waits. The next morning brought a stillness that felt earned, the kind that didn't just belong to the hour of the day, but to the people inside it. Lila was still sleeping when I slipped out of the bed and headed to the kitchen. The air was crisp, the kind that promised a warm day after a cool night. And the early sun lit the garden beds we'd built like they were quietly applauding the work we'd done. Even the basil seemed to stand a little taller in the morning. Light. I didn't want to disturb her, so I kept things quiet, boiling water for coffee, slicing up some fruit, scrambling eggs with just enough salt. I set everything on the table not because I expected anything from it, but because it felt right. Because someone once told me that love was in the doing, not the declaring. I had started to understand what that meant here, when she finally came out wearing that same worn flannel from the day before and rubbing sleep from her eyes. She froze in the doorway and looked at the breakfast table like it was something sacred. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, voice still. "Scratchy from sleep?" "I know," I said. "That's why I did." She smiled then, slow and warm, the kind of smile that made you feel like you'd just been handed something rare. She sat down and ate without saying much, but her silence was comfortable, not companionable, not cautious. When we were done, she helped clear the plates and stood beside me at the sink as we washed and dried in sync afterward. She pulled me toward the backyard with that familiar glimmer in her eyes. "I want to put wind chimes up," she said, "and maybe a bench." We drove to the local craft market later that day. A little place nestled under a grove of sycamores, where old folks sold handmade things and young artists painted on site. She found a set of chimes made from driftwood and copper pipes and held them up like they were some ancient relic. "These sound like the sea," she said, "like home." I didn't ask what home meant, I just nodded. We bought them, and a weathered wooden bench that needed some sanding and oil, but had more character than anything store-bought. We hauled everything back and spent the afternoon assembling, hanging, rearranging, turning the once lonely backyard into something like a sanctuary. The wind picked up just enough to send the chimes into a soft, melodic tinkle as we sat on the bench side by side, sipping iced tea. Leela leaned her head on my shoulder and said nothing. She didn't have to. Later that evening, we ended up walking through the neighborhood. Something she hadn't done since the night I first found her, standing in the driveway, barefoot and afraid. Now she wore sandals and a light scarf, and her steps had purpose. We walked slowly, occasionally stopping to look at flowers or point out quirky things in people's yards. She paused near the old corner house and stared at a bird bath that had been painted like a mosaic. "I never realized how much I missed just being outside without looking over my shoulder," she said, "because now you feel safe." Not just because of you, but partly because of you. It's like I'm remembering who I was before everything went sideways. We turned the corner, and she slipped her hand into mine without a word. We didn't need one, back at the house. She surprised me by suggesting we cook together, something she admitted she used to dread doing when she was with him. He made it a performance, she said, like I was supposed to impress him, or apologize with every dish I made. We made tacos, simple, messy, fun. She spilled guacamole on her shirt and laughed like it didn't matter, because it didn't. We played music and danced a little, awkward and silly, until we were both breathless. And grinning, when we finally sat down to eat, she raised her glass and said, "To the small things. To the things that feel big when they're safe," I added, that night. The wind chimes played a lullaby through the open windows. The moonlight pooled across the floorboards, and we sat on the bench again, wrapped in a blanket, sharing a bowl of strawberries. She was quiet, but not withdrawn, thoughtful. "I used to think I had to be broken forever," she said finally. "Like damage was a permanent part of me." "It's not," I said. "It's a layer, not the whole story." She looked at me, really looked at me, and there was something like peace in her gaze. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of strength. "You make it easier to believe that," she whispered. I wanted to say something perfect, something that would match the weight of what she'd just given me. What all I could do was squeeze her hand and nod. And somehow, that was enough. We sat there long into the night, the stars blinking overhead like distant candles, and the wind chimes catching every gentle breeze. Like they were translating the world into something soft and forgiving. I felt her. Head rest against me again, heavier this time, trusting. And as the night deepened, I realized something profound. I wasn't here to rescue her. I was just here to witness her rescue herself, and maybe in doing that, find a part of myself I didn't know I'd lost. The next few days unfolded like slow jazz meandering, Jin's subtle shifts not rushed by any urgency but paced by presence. Every morning began with the sound of wind chimes brushing the air. Every evening ending with quiet conversations under the stars. Lila had started sleeping through the night without waking up, gasping or clutching the sheets. She told me that in passing, almost casually, but I could see it meant more to her than she let on. It was a reclaiming of something stolen: rest, ease, the right to feel safe in one's own home. We fell into a rhythm, a quiet domestic choreography that didn't need discussion or assignment. I fixed the broken hinge on her pantry door. She started leaving her bedroom door open when she slept, replaced the dim bulbs in her hallway with soft, warm lights. She started playing music again while she cooked or cleaned. I offered to clean out the old shed in her backyard, and she surprised me by insisting we do it together. If I leave it to you, I'll never know what's in there. Maybe it's time I did. The shed hadn't been touched in years. Cobwebs hung like gauze from the ceiling, and dust coated every shelf, every forgotten object. Old garden tools, half-burned candles, cardboard boxes with faded labels. But it was one box near the back that made her stop cold. She stood there, unmoving, eyes locked on the handwriting scrawled across the top. Lila Journal's photos, old life. I packed this up right after the divorce, she said quietly. Thought maybe one day I'd feel strong enough to look through it, but I kept locking the shed instead. We sat on the floor of the shed. The door cracked open just enough to let the afternoon sun spill through like a spotlight. She opened the box with slow hands like she wasn't sure what she'd find. Inside were worn leather-bound journals, a few photo albums, and a stack of postcards tied with a red ribbon. Her hands trembled as she pulled out one of the journals and flipped it open. I didn't try to read over her shoulder, but I stayed. Close, a grounding presence if she needed it. I used to write every night, she said, flipping through pages. Before everything got too loud in my head, there was a moment of silence, then she laughed softly. Oh my God. Listen to this entry from 2008. I met a guy at the coffee shop who said I look like Kate Blanchett. He might be full of it, but I'm choosing to believe him today. I laughed with her. Not because it was funny, but because hearing her find amusement in her own memories was a form of healing. She pulled out a photo of herself at 26, standing on a beach with wind-blown hair and a look in her eyes that I hadn't seen until now. It was clarity, freedom. Before, do you see her? She asked me, holding the photo up. That's me, right? She never left, I said gently. She just had to wait for you to catch up. She didn't speak for a while after that. Stayed in the shed, slowly going through more pieces of her past pictures with friends, scribbled poems on the backs of receipts, dried flowers pressed between pages of books. With each item she touched, something loosened in her posture. Not sadness exactly, more like an uncoiling of something long held tight. By the time we left the shed, the sun was low, painting the backyard in long orange streaks. She set the journals on the table like they were freshly picked fruit, ready to be examined and peeled. I want to start writing again, she said suddenly. Not about the past, about now. That night we sat outside with cups of tea and shared the bench beneath. The chimes. She had her notebook open and pen in hand, scribbling little bits of thought, glancing up at the stars every so often. I watched her, not to intrude, but to remember. To remember this moment, her silhouette against the night, the sound of copper, pipes singing softly in the wind, the feeling of finally seeing someone be whole again. After a while, she put the notebook down and turned to me. Can I ask you something? Anything, I said. If I told you I was falling in love with? This life, not just the moments, but all of it, would that scare you off? Not even close, I replied. I think I've been falling with you the whole time." She leaned her head against mine, and we didn't say anything else. The silence was filled with every word we didn't need to speak. The next day, she made a list of things she wanted to do. Not big dreams, no talk of world travel or bucket lists, but simple, deeply personal goals. Bake a pie from scratch. Visit the library downtown. Take a pottery class. Host dinner for someone other than me. She wrote each one with purpose, as if naming them gave them weight and permission. I looked at her list and felt proud in a way that surprised me. Not pride in what I had done, but in what she had chosen to reclaim. Her agency, her voice. Future. Later that afternoon, as we sat on the couch watching a storm roll in, she turned to me and said something that would echo in my mind for days after. "You were supposed to be a stranger with a hose." I laughed. "Well, technically I still am." "No," she said. "You're the reason I opened the door that day. Something in your voice, your eyes, I don't know." But I heard myself whisper, "Help me." And for the first time, I believed someone might actually listen. I didn't know what to say, so I kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'm still listening." Outside, the rain started tapping against the windows. The driveway, once cracked and forgotten, gleamed under the falling drops. And inside, a woman who once stood frozen in her pajamas had come back to life, one whispered plea at a time. The rain carried on through most of the night, and I stayed there with her, neither of us bothered by the storm or the occasional flicker of the lights. In fact, the sound of it became a kind of lullaby, and the darkness that once haunted the corners of her home now felt softened, reshaped by the quiet companionship we'd built. We didn't need to fill the silence with words anymore, not like before. The pauses in our conversations had started to feel like punctuation, not voids. That night she wrote again, this time more confidently, and as she wrote, she read a few lines aloud. Something about finding safety not in walls or locks, but in understanding. The next morning broke bright and clear, the world washed clean. The air smelled of petrichor and renewal. I stepped outside to see how the rain had transformed the backyard, and even the old bench under the chimes seemed refreshed. Lila came out with 2 mugs of coffee and sat beside me, her shoulder brushing. Mine like punctuation at the end of a thought. "I didn't dream last night," she said quietly. "I just slept. It's a win," I said, and we clinked mugs together gently. We spent that day working on her list. First was the library downtown, a place she hadn't been to in years because it had always reminded her of the person. She used to be hopeful, open, maybe to trusting. But when we stepped through those glass doors, I saw something in her shift. The space didn't swallow her like she feared. Instead, it welcomed her. She walked the aisles slowly, letting her fingers brush against the spines of novels, memoirs, old poetry collections. She checked out 3 books, 1 fiction, 1 self-help. And 1 old cookbook and carried them to the counter with a kind of quiet ceremony. We stopped by a small cafe afterward, and over soup and warm bread she told me stories about her college days, how she used to dream of opening a bookstore, how she once tried to write a novel but gave up after 30 pages. There was joy in her telling, but also a thread of sorrow, as though every story she told was both a celebration and an apology for dreams deferred. I didn't try to fix that feeling. I just listened, and that seemed to be what she needed more than anything. When we got home, she disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard the rustle of her going through the cabinets. A few minutes later, she called out, "I'm making pie. Don't laugh if it's awful." I didn't laugh. I watched from the hallway as she rolled out dough on a flowered countertop, the window light catching in her hair. She moved with nervous concentration, muttering under her breath when the crust cracked or the filling bubbled too high. But there was a lightness to her now, even in her uncertainty. She was trying. She was living. The pie came out lopsided, slightly burnt on one edge. But when we ate it on the porch, it tasted like triumph. She laughed with her whole face, head tilted back, and I could see the younger version of Hertha one in those old journal entries, shining through more vividly than ever. In the days that followed, we checked off more items from her list. The pottery class was a mess of wet clay and crooked bowls, but we kept the first two as trophies. She hosted a small dinner for her friend Clara, whom she hadn't seen in over a year. When watching the two of them reconnect over candlelight, and laughter felt like witnessing someone rediscover an entire limb they thought they'd lost. There were hard days too, of course. Moments where her voice went tight at the edges, or her gaze drifted away and didn't return for a beat too long. But those moments didn't define her anymore. They passed. She passed through them. I was always there, not to shield her, but to remind her that she didn't have to navigate it all alone. One afternoon, as we were walking through a park not far from her place, she paused at a small pond where children were feeding ducks. One little girl, maybe 5 or 6, tripped and scraped her knee, and the mother rushed over, flustered and apologizing. Lila crouched down, asked the girl if she wanted help cleaning the scrape, and offered her a tissue from her bag. It was a small thing, a blink-and-do-miss-it kind of kindness, but I saw the way Lila's eyes softened, the way she didn't flinch or hesitate, how naturally she offered care without fear creeping in. Afterward, she was quiet. We sat on a bench, and I asked her if she was okay. I used to be terrified of seeing pain in other people, she said. It made mine feel louder, but today, I just wanted to help. That's new. You're building muscle, I said. Not just strength, but emotional muscle. You're trusting yourself again. She looked at me then, really looked, and her eyes were clear, not weighed down by old ghosts. You keep saying I'm healing, but what if I'm not? What if I'm just learning to live with the mess? I nodded. Then that's healing. 2. No one ever said healing meant erasing everything. Sometimes it's just learning to carry it better. We stayed on that bench for a long time, the wind moving through the trees. Children laughing in the distance and something inside both of us settling into place. I wasn't just a helper anymore, or a passerby in her chapter. I had become part of the story she was writing now. The one where she didn't need to whisper for help anymore because she had learned to speak her needs out loud and trust that someone would stay to hear them. That night, back at her house, she pulled out the last item on her list, repainting the bedroom. A fresh start. We went to the hardware store the next morning, picked out paint swatches and soft sage and warm cream, and debated brushes versus rollers like old pros. She taped up the windows, moved the furniture herself, and laughed when she got paint on her nose. This room used to feel like a tomb, she said as we finished the first coat. Now it feels like a beginning. Out. And that's exactly what. It was the next few days slipped into a rhythm that felt less like recovery and more like living. The bedroom, now bathed in soft sage and trimmed with cream, had a quiet warmth that matched the woman who slept inside it. The small victories were stacking up like books on a nightstand. Her journaling had turned into short essays, and she'd started reading chapters aloud to me over breakfast. They were raw and messy, honest in a way that made you feel like you were holding someone's heart with bare hands. Some were about fear, others about finding beauty in the mundane, a chipped mug, the sound of an old heater kicking on in the winter, or the way a certain song could walk her back to the age of 27 in an instant. There was one she read. It's about her ex-husband. She paused several times while reading it, her voice catching, eyes shining not with grief, but with clarity. She wasn't trying to erase him anymore. She was rewriting what he meant, giving context to the chaos he brought, but refusing to let that be the final note. When she finished, I didn't applaud or comment. I just reached across the table, palm up, and she took my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world that weekend. We took a day trip to a small town about an hour away. It had antique stores and a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and childhood. She wore a flowy sundress and wide-brimmed hat that made her look like she'd stepped out of a forgotten summer. We wandered into a little bookstore with creaky floors and handwritten staff recommendations. I watched her from the corner of the poetry section as she picked up a worn copy of Mary Oliver and smiled like she was greeting an old friend. We sat on a bench outside that bookstore eating pastries and watching the world drift by. She pulled a notebook from her bag, scribbled a few lines, and then looked up at me with a sudden seriousness. Do you think people get to choose when their story starts over? I thought about it for a moment before answering. No, I think sometimes. The story just pauses. And then, when you're finally ready or brave enough, you'll press play again. She nodded, folded the notebook shut, and leaned her head on my shoulder. Then I think I just hit play. At night. Back at her place, something changed between us, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a way that felt like two puzzle pieces quietly finding their fit. We made dinner together, laughing when we burned the garlic bread and ended up eating salad with wine instead. She lit candles even though the overhead light worked just fine, and I noticed how the shadows flickered across her face like brush strokes on a canvas. There was a moment when she looked tanned. I saw it in her eyes, the question she wasn't asking. I didn't lean in. I didn't make a move. But I placed my hand over hers and she didn't pull away. Instead, she exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for years. That night, I didn't sleep in the guest room. We didn't rush anything. There were no fireworks or proclamations of love. Just her head on my chest and my hand resting against the curve of her spine. Both of us listening to the steady rhythm of a house that had finally grown quiet enough to let us breathe in the morning. She was already in the kitchen when I woke up, humming along to an old Motown song. She danced a little as she moved, and when she saw me in the doorway, she didn't pause or pull away. She smiled like we'd been doing this for decades and handed me a cup of coffee. We talked about what this meant, what we were. She was honest, as always. She told me she didn't want to rush into labels or plans, that she was still figuring herself out. I told her that was more than okay, that I wasn't here for a title, was here for her. However she came, whatever shape her heart was taking these days. And she nodded, her hands slipping into mine as we sat on the back porch, the chimes catching the breeze, the future quietly unfolding between us. She started hosting a small writer's circle in her living room. Just 3 women to start, all of them scribbling in notebooks and reading their pieces aloud while sipping wine and laughing about metaphors that didn't quite land. I helped set up the chairs and brought snacks, happily playing the role of behind-the-scenes support. I'd often find myself in the hallway listening, not intruding but present, hearing her voice grow stronger with every shared story. One night after everyone had left, she came to find me outside. I was putting away the last few plates, and she wrapped her arms around me from behind. "I feel like I'm building something again," she whispered. "Not just a life, but a community, a reason to stay awake in the morning." I turned around and kissed her forehead. "You are, and they're lucky to be part of it." As the weeks rolled on, we fell into something steady, not without its bumps or hesitations, but rooted in something real. She started volunteering at the local shelter on weekends, reading to kids who didn't always have someone at home to do it. She didn't tell me until I noticed her collecting books in a canvas bag one Saturday morning. When I asked, she shrugged, bashful. "I just thought maybe I could be the voice someone else needed." "The way you were for me." It hit me then, the full circle of it. How healing can ripple outward, a one whispered "help me," can lead to a dozen voices being heard. That evening, she sat beside me as we watched an old movie, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the lines of my palm. There was no talk of forever or what came next. Just the sound of laughter from the screen, the warmth of 2 bodies sharing the same breath, and the knowledge that sometimes a beginning doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be true. The late days of spring carried a certain kind of promise in the air. The sunlight lingered a little longer each evening, and the world around us seemed to slow into a more forgiving rhythm. Leela had started leaving the curtains open now, not in defiance, but in peace. The shadows no longer threatened her. The house that once stood like a fortress was slowly becoming what it was meant to be, a home. She changed the artwork in the hallway, donated the stiff furniture that held too many silent memories, and even ordered new dishes, joking that if she was going to invite the world in, at least she should be able to serve tea on something other than chipped mugs. That morning, I came over to help hang a new wind chime she'd picked up during a craft fair in the neighboring town. It was made of turquoise glass and copper, and it sang in soft, irregular tones. We stood back and listened to it, catch the breeze, both of us smiling, not saying much, but wrapped in the kind of quiet that only comes when 2 people understand. How much has already been said. She had her first speaking event at the library that week. Just a small gathering, mostly local readers and a few writers she'd met online. I offered to stay in the back, out of view, but she shook her head and told me, "No, I want you right there in the front. You're part of the story now." She wore a soft green blouse that matched her eyes and a thin gold necklace that trembled slightly when she breathed. Her palms were shaking when she took the microphone, but she didn't try to hide it. She opened with a simple sentence. 6 months ago, I didn't think I'd ever be here again. I didn't think I wanted to be. Then she told her story, not the full, raw journal entries, but the arc of it. The loneliness, the fear. The woman who stood barefoot on a front porch, whispering help me to a man she'd never met before. In the slow, often halting journey back to herself, there were tears in the room, but more than that, there was recognition. Nods, hushed sighs. One woman reached over to squeeze her friend's hand. Another wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. Afterward, people came up to thank her. One woman said, "I've been afraid to say I need help, but maybe it's time." And another added, "I used to feel safe. I didn't realize how much I missed that." Lila took it all in graciously, offering warm smiles, listening more. Then she spoke, her hand occasionally drifting to mine when someone's words hit close to home. We walked to the car in silence. When we got inside, she turned to me and said, "I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't." "You weren't saying goodbye to the pain," I told her. "You were giving it shape." "That's different." She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not scared of being seen anymore." That night, I stayed over. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She curled into me as we drifted off, and at some point in the early morning, I woke to her whispering something in her sleep. I couldn't catch all of it, but I heard my name and the word safe, and I knew something deep inside her had finally settled. The next morning was filled with sun, the kind of golden light that made everything feel touched by grace. I cooked us breakfast while she watered her garden, singing under her breath. The smell of toast and coffee filled the air, and when she walked in with a daisy tucked behind her ear, I realized something I hadn't let myself say out loud yet. I was falling in love with her, not in a fiery, all-consuming way, but in the kind of love that grows roots. It's the kind that steadies you. I didn't tell her not then. I didn't need to. I was showing her every day in small gestures. The squeaky cabinet hinge, placing the light bulb in her closet before she asked, quietly replacing the worn doormat she never liked. Later that week, we took a drive out to the lake. She brought sandwiches, and I packed a blanket. We sat near the water for hours, watching kids skip rocks, ducks chasing each other, and clouds turning from white to amber. She rested her head on my shoulder and said, "I used to imagine what a peaceful life would look like. I think this is it." I almost replied, but she stopped me. "Don't say anything. Let's just stay in this moment for a while." And we didn't rush the silence. We let it stretch comfortably, like the soft embrace of something real. She reached into her bag, pulled out her journal, and began to write. I leaned back and listened to the lake, the soft scratch of her pen, and the wind through the trees. We stayed until the sun began to dip low, casting the whole world in hues of honey and fire. As we packed up, she turned to me, and for the first time in a long while, I saw no hesitation in her eyes. "You've never once tried to save me," she said, "and that's how I know I'm safe with you." I smiled, not trusting myself to speak. We drove back in silence again, hand in hand, the night filling in around us like a warm blanket. That house, once a prison of memory, now looked like a lighthouse as we pulled up, the porch light glowing softly, the chimes dancing in the breeze, and the sound of peace living in the quiet. There's something peculiar about the final stretch of a journey, not the loud celebration of arrival or the dramatic climax we often expect from stories, but the quiet, sacred unfolding of what comes after. For Lila and me, that final stretch didn't look like wedding rings or proclamations or any grand gesture. It looked like Sundays filled with pancake batter on her cheeks, like mismatched socks tossed near the laundry basket, like grocery lists written on napkins and dog-eared library books scattered across the coffee table. It looked like life, not the fantasy we once tried to force, but the real thing, flawed and beautiful and deeply grounding. The weeks following her library talk felt like a continuation of her rising. People began emailing her, asking if she'd consider sharing her words on small podcasts or blogs. At first, she was hesitant, terrified, but I reminded her that what she was offering wasn't perfection. It was truth, and that was rare. She began accepting a few invitations here and there. I'd help her set up the microphone, check the lighting if it was video, and sit just out of frame, giving her a silent thumbs up before each recording started. Meanwhile, the community around us slowly began to change. The woman next door, the one who used to peek through her curtains with suspicion, now dropped off lemons from her tree with little notes like "for your tea" or "when life gives you ... you know." One of the neighborhood kids came by with a handmade bookmark for Lila, decorated in glitter and crayon hearts. There was laughter in the backyard against sometimes hers, sometimes mine, often both. We even had a picnic with her writers group in the backyard, a full circle from where we started, where a man stood with a pressure washer, and a woman stood with nothing left to give. And then, one afternoon, as I was fixing the lock on her, back gate something she hadn't trusted anyone else to touch. She walked out with 2 mugs of lemonade and leaned against the fence post. Her hair was still damp from a shower, and her cheeks glowed not from makeup, but from sun and joy and something wholly internal. "I've been thinking," she said, handing me a mug, "about everything." "Dangerous," I teased. She smiled. "Maybe, but also necessary. I used to think that pain was the only real thing, that if I didn't guard myself constantly, it would eat me whole. But lately, I've started trusting the good things again." She paused, eyes scanning the horizon like it held the memory of who she used to be. "And you?" she asked softly. "What do you see when you look at me now?" I set down the mug, wiped my hands, thought for a long moment. "I see the bravest person I've ever met," I said. "I see someone who refused to stay broken, someone who asked for help not to be saved, but to be witnessed." And I saw her rise. I still see her rising. She didn't cry. Neither did I. We just stood there for a while, our fingers brushing at our sides, the sun slipping lower behind the trees. Later that evening, as we sat on the porch listening to vinyl records and sharing a bowl of popcorn, she reached into her journal and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I want to read you something," she said. "It's not for the blog. It's just for you." She cleared her throat. "There is a man who walked into my life with nothing but kind eyes and quiet patience. He didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. He didn't fill silences that needed to breathe. He stood beside me in the storm, not with an umbrella, but with presence. And now that the storm is past, he still stands here. And that, I'm learning, is what safety looks like." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, reached for her hand, and let the moment stretch. Weeks turned into months, and the milestones continued. Not grand or loud, but meaningful. The day she changed the locks herself. The moment she canceled her last therapy appointment, not out of avoidance, but because she felt ready. The morning she said, "I love you," without needing to hear it back immediately. I did say it back. Eventually, on a Tuesday morning, as we folded laundry of all things. She laughed, called me ridiculous, and kissed me over a pair of mismatched socks. One night as autumn approached, we sat on the porch wrapped in a shared blanket. The wind was sharp, and the stars above us were crisp and cold. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Do you think this lasts?" "I think it grows," I replied, and it did. It's not because it was perfect, but because we chose it every day in small, intentional ways. Through burnt toast and deep conversations, through sick days and celebrations, through quiet nights and unexpected tears, we kept choosing. And that made all the difference. In the end, she never went back to being the woman she was before I met her. She became someone new, someone stronger, someone softer. She became a version of herself that I don't think even she believed she could become. And me, I didn't become a hero. I didn't save anyone. I just showed up day after day. Patience, with respect, with love that asked for nothing but presence in return. Now, years later, when people ask us how we met, we always laugh. She say, He was just the guy pressure washing my driveway. I'll say she was the woman who taught me that the strongest thing a person can do is ask for help. Because sometimes stories don't begin with a kiss or a chance. Meeting in a crowded bar? Sometimes they start with a whisper, a door cracked open, cry for help, and if you're lucky, you answer. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.